Happy Memorial Day, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Go Beyond. Today, we are focusing on the book of Esther, and it was the last character that we were looking at in our worship series, Facing Giants. And so I had a chance to read through the book of Esther yesterday. It's still pretty short, only about 10 chapters. And I have to say, it is one of the most well-written books that I've read in the Bible. It's almost as if it was written in modern day language. It's so easy to follow and it's such great storytelling. So I'm really excited to unpack this a little bit more. There's so much drama and so many layers to the story, and it's a really exciting story. But I know that first, before we dig into the questions that I had for Pastor Daniel today, he wanted to set up a little bit of context and understanding of the Hebrew faith and some traditions that came out of this story. So Daniel, what do you have for us?
Yeah, so just a couple things. One, just real quick on the pointing out of how well written it is. It's extremely well written, and I just mentioned again how well the Jewish tradition tells stories, and Esther's a great example of that, right? And so if you want to know more, Alyssa, or anybody else, what most of us don't realize is that in the Greek Bible and in the portion called the Apocrypha that Protestants don't consider as authoritative but are interesting, there's a whole nother set of chapters to the book of Esther. In fact, there's 6 more chapters, but their content is literally almost twice as long as what you got to read. So if you want to go into the Apocrypha, read the additions to Esther, and there's 6 more chapters. It's really cool. It's fascinating because there's even more Game of Thrones stuff that's going on in there. But the second thing I want to point out is the book of Esther really is in the Bible, and many believe, to help justify and help point out the religious festival called Purim. Purim is one of the great Jewish holidays that most folks don't even know about. You know, we know about Hanukkah, we know about Rosh Hashanah, right, and those kinds of things, but we don't know about Purim. And yet, if you ask most Jews, it's their favorite holiday. And it's their favorite holiday because it's a big party. And it's a big party because of the book of Esther. There are and it just happened actually, just before all the COVID stuff happened, Purim had taken place. It's usually somewhere in late February to early March. And it happens at that date based on the book of Esther. The book of Esther gives us the date, and it takes its name from what Haman did. You remember Haman cast lots, and they called that Pur, P-U-R. And so when he cast that lot, it set the date. And the date was when Haman was going to, of course, kill all the Jews. But it now becomes the date that the Jews celebrate Purim because of casting lots. And casting lots in ancient tradition and certainly biblical stories is a religious thing, actually. And even some of the disciples cast lots after Jesus's death. But Purim is a great celebration. So the story of Esther is always read. You go to the synagogue, you read the entire story during the celebration. They always have a festive meal. And at that festive meal, it is required that the adults drink. It's just a requirement, much like the party that the king has, right? It's not 180 days, but it's a big party. And then the other thing that has to happen is you're supposed to give food to the poor, and you're supposed to share food with one another, like gift baskets. And so often kids dress up, there are parties and there are dramas. And it's in our realm, it's almost like a huge conglomeration of New Year's Day and Easter with baskets and Halloween with dress up. And it's this huge party. And it all comes from this book called Esther. And it's a great party. Look it up or encourage folks to look it up because it's a cool deal. And it's all coming from this book called Esther.
Very cool. Well, I'll definitely be interested in reading the Apocrypha too, because this was such a fun story. I want to know more. I want to know more about each of the characters and what was going on in their minds and everything. So yeah, that'll definitely be something I do. So diving into the questions for today, the very first thing that I noticed in the entire 10 chapters of Esther that I read, God is not mentioned once. Yep. And I researched that a little bit, and I found that actually when they were deciding on which books would be in the Bible, some people thought that it was inappropriate for Esther to be in the Bible because God isn't mentioned. And of course, you know, the fact that they were of the Jewish faith is mentioned, but there's nothing about God. And so what do we make of this?
Well, I mean, first of all, kudos for learning that, because it really is. There are a few books in our canon, the Bible, that almost didn't make it, and Esther's one of those. And it has to do with what you just said. For those who were sort of the critics, they said, golly, there's nothing religious, spiritual, godlike in here. For those who believed that there was, their belief, and obviously it kind of worked because it made it into the canon, was while God is not mentioned at all, God is just sort of clearly emanating, if you will, in and through the story with various things, much like when Esther calls for a prayer and fasting for 3 days, that is sort of understood. Well, that's a Jewish concept of the day. Therefore, there's some religiosity to it. The other is that God somehow seems to be in control of all this. In other words, everything that was going against the Jews, whether it was the kingdom or Haman or whatever, it all seems to be working out in the Jews' favor. And the belief, therefore, was, well, God must be in control. The providence of God must sort of overpower everything else. And so that's kind of what took shape. But yeah, for centuries now, there are many who say, golly, Esther's not worth anything because God is not mentioned and there's nothing overtly spiritual about it. But for those who can read into the story, as I do, that God is just sort of hovering quite literally over what's going on. There are some who refer to it as God as a marionette puppeteer. I don't go quite that far, but I do believe God is just emanating in and through the story, even though God's never mentioned.
Well, and also, I was kind of confused on how am I supposed to read the book of Esther? Is it historical? Is it a wisdom tale? Is it a romance? Is it true? Is it because I also, when I get interested in a story, I research it. So I did more research behind this and was depending less on what you had to say. I was like, no, I want to look into this myself before I ask the question. But there's no evidence outside of the Bible for many of these characters. So how are we supposed to take in this information?
Yeah, well, so again, the Jewish tradition, whether scriptural or otherwise, is heavily based in storytelling, right? Heavily based. And so there are some Old Testament books, Esther being one of them, Ruth, which we read earlier, Job being another, perhaps even Jonah, are stories that may not be historical, that is to say, having historical precedent, but rather are faith stories that help us better understand our connection and relationship with God. And they were written that way, intended that way, and we likewise probably ought to look at them that way. Now, some would look at that and go, oh my gosh, how could you even say that? But golly, we have a huge precedent for that in the Christian tradition, in the Gospels. They're called parables. The parables were not intended to be historical events, and yet they're deeply religious, deeply spiritual, and have great truth behind them, right? And so sometimes these stories, like Esther, are probably written with this great spiritual purpose to understand providence of God, the God who has favor for the chosen people, the Jews, and therefore these pogroms or whatever that would sort of go against Jews are God seems to be there and helping out in these times. And so I would not read Esther as history. I would read Esther as a faith journey and a faith story that helps teach me a spiritual lesson.
So my next question that I have is at the very beginning of this story and how this story kicks off and creates a domino effect of events is with Queen Vashti, who basically refuses King Xerxes' request, command for her to come out and dance for the people and display her beauty. And she was dismissed, and his advisors said, you have to dismiss her from the kingdom, or else women will rise up against their husbands and start to disobey their husbands. And there was this huge fear around women. And I think that one of the exact words were, well, maybe not exact words, but the Alyssa interpretation is, no matter how bad your husband is, it doesn't matter. Women should be subservient. And there was this fear around women rising up against their husbands. And why was there that great fear of the power of women at that time?
Well, I mean, Esther is a book of its time, right? It is centuries old, millennia old, really. And so clearly it's in a patriarchal system where men hold power, authority. it is a part of the book that we would want to say, golly, we don't live into that anymore at all. And yet it was the reality of the day. And so, Esther's full of these dichotomies, because as you rightfully point out, here's this deal where we're just going to put sort of Vashti on a pedestal, if you will, and we just want to see her beauty. And the same goes for Esther, right? Because the whole reason Esther got replaced Vashti was because she had beauty as well, right? And yet here is a book of the Bible named after a woman whose primary character is a woman and whose primary function was to help save her people by standing up and speaking forth her truth. And so it's this huge dichotomy of, all the stuff of the day and all of the patriarchy of the day, and yet the powerful story of she's the kingpin, if you will. She's the one who makes it all possible, this woman named Esther. So it's just fascinating, I think.
Yeah, it just really strikes me because I guess my expectation in reading about, these cultures from so far back where it was clearly a patriarchal society was that the men wouldn't be afraid of the women whatsoever, and it would be dismissive. But there just seemed to be this like deep rooted, like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do if women realize that they have a voice?
And ultimately Esther gets a voice, right? I mean, that's of course the sort of point of the story. I mean, chapter 4, where Mordecai kind of encourages her, and we have that famous passage, perhaps you've been selected for royalty for just such a time as this. But then you get into chapter 8, and after it's discovered that Haman has created this horrible circumstance and they actually kill Haman, I mean, it's Esther that the king talks to. I remember this. So chapter 8, verse 2, it just says, so Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the king gave the house of Haman to Esther, not to Mordecai. And then Esther has the authority to then give it to Mordecai. And then the king, Esther speaks again to the king, and she begins to say, hey, can you make this decree go away? So it's Esther's voice that allows this to happen. And I think that's why, for instance, I think you were going to ask me something about, golly, Mordecai seems to get all the glory, but this is not called the book of Mordecai. This is the book of Esther. And Esther's the one who actually holds the cards that give Mordecai any kind of authority. She's the one who hands over Haman's house to Mordecai. She's the one who asks the king to give reverse or erase the decree. She really has more power than we tend to think, particularly given that it's a patriarchal society. For her to have this kind of power and authority in a patriarchal society is pretty amazing when all is said and done.
So my next question is about what was the attitude towards the Jewish people at the time? Because I just made the assumption that, okay, well, for Haman to attack Mordecai the way that he did, there was a deep-seated hatred for the Jews to begin with. And Esther hid that she was Jewish, but it doesn't really say why. In the scripture, it says that Haman was angry with Mordecai because Mordecai didn't bow down to him, and then later found out that Mordecai was Jewish. And so it was almost as if he didn't like Mordecai and then used his faith to get revenge. And so was that because he was Jewish, or was that just used as an excuse to hate the Jews when they hadn't before?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, the whole point of the story of Esther is to identify that the chosen people of God, the Jews, are constantly being bombarded with oppression, right? I mean, they were set in slavery in Egypt centuries before. They were enslaved in Babylon prior. And now Haman's going to create this other deal. We call the modern day, we call that pogroms, right? Where they're oppressed or suppressed or literally killed. And so, yeah, there's this long-standing hatred of the Jews. And it can be as simple as, hey, your faith is different than ours. We follow other gods. You follow a God that we don't care for, right? So we don't like you because you're Jewish. Or it could also be because the Jews are rightfully identified as the chosen people of God. Well, guess what? If you're not a part of the chosen, guess what you don't like? that you're chosen, right? So I'm going to hate you because somehow you're either following another God that we don't profess belief in, or you're chosen, and I don't want to not be chosen. So I'm going to sort of hate you. So while you rightfully point out that Haman is ticked off initially because basically Mordecai just doesn't give him, rightful praise, if you will, because he's full of himself, right? Haman is full of himself. I mean, he's been given the right hand from the king, and he wants everybody else to know it. And Mordecai doesn't do that. What's intimated in chapter 3 here by Mordecai's behavior is he will not bow down to Haman because he's Jewish, and he will therefore not bow down to anybody but God. It does not say that, but it's intimated of why, because when you read it and you get through a couple of the verses, it identifies that Mordecai actually says to Haman's underlings, I'm Jewish, and basically says, I'm not going to bow down because I'm Jewish. And then it's after he doesn't bow down to Haman that the guards or his underlings actually say to Haman, hey, this guy's Jewish, and he's probably not going to bow down to you because that's not how his faith won't allow him to bow down to you. And so for Haman, I think it's a double whammy. He's not giving me proper authority, and he's of this other religion. And so, man, I'm just going to eradicate all of them because they're no good. These people, they're not us. They're different. So I'm just going to eradicate all of them. But it's an early sign of what will become these pogroms century after century after century against the Hebrew people.
Well, so my last question, so I know that I'm biased, and I know that I'm reading this scripture as a 21st century woman, but it is really difficult for me to like Mordecai. It's really difficult. He seems like a jerk to me. And that's not the word that I used when I emailed you. He seems like a jerk to me. And to me, he feels like a puppeteer pulling the strings of Esther. He kind of submitted her into this campaign to become queen. Do we know that she wanted that? Do we know that that was a path that she cared about? And so it just feels like from beginning to end, Mordecai is trying to make the decisions for her. And it wasn't until, like, the book is entitled Esther. She is this strong woman, but we don't even hear her words and her voice until Mordecai gives the speech for such a time as this. And that's when we start to hear from Esther directly. And so why is it that Mordecai gets to be one of the heroes of this story? It bothers me.
Well, so I get that. So again, it feels to me like you're reading a lot of history into this versus this is a great story that helps us understand a grander picture. And so the characters are going to have their roles to play, right? They're going to and Mordecai and Esther have this amazing relationship. In many ways, he has, saved her from dilemma by, adopting her, if you will. And then I don't doubt, though I don't have a clue, he probably sees some great potential by, hey, why don't you get involved and why don't you see if you can become queen? And golly, this might help us. And it appears that he's actually trying to work on behalf of the Jews, not himself. And then I sort of read it, and I think this is just two different people reading the same story, right? I sort of read it as he sees his opportunity as a way to use Esther for the Jews, not for himself. And therefore, he's going to continue to, quote unquote, prop her up. He's going to continue to kind of give her guidance. But I mean, you see, for instance, Mordecai saves the king as well, right? He overhears the story of, two of the eunuchs who are going to overthrow or whatever. And so he saves the king. And so he's actually in with the king as well. But I think he realizes he can't have power. He can't have authority. So I'm going to figure out a way to make sure that Esther gets power and authority and kind of feed her information and feed her ideals, if you will. That's the way I read it. So, I choose to believe Esther is the hero of this story, and I choose to believe she actually has all the power. Mordecai's really a behind the scenes guy who is really just kind of helping her see how to play her role to the best of her ability. Like, I don't know, a campaign manager, if you will, who just kind of, helps give you what you need to be the best candidate you can be. That's the way I read it. Mordecai has a role to play, but I don't see Mordecai as a hero at all. I see Mordecai as the second fiddle guy, way behind Esther, but giving her clues and guidance and information.
Well, I will say from the beginning of the story, I was Team Vashti, so my character lost.
Well, there you go. So read the additions to Esther, because there's some more to Vashti there.
Vashti. Oh, I keep saying Vashti. Is it Vashti?
Vashti. That's the way. I had to double check. That's the way my Hebrew scholar book reads. So that's the way I choose to call her.
Well, that is all that we have for today, but thank y'all for joining us for another episode of Go Beyond. I hope that you're enjoying some time with your loved ones and your family if you're able. And remember, we will be live again at Wednesday at 12:30 for an episode of Go Beyond, where I get to challenge the story of Esther, which today felt a little challenging.
Have we not already done that?
Wednesday, this book fired me up. Wednesday is going to get even more spirited. Let's say that. So I'm really excited about it. And as always, you can catch all previous episodes of Go Beyond at tmumc.org/go beyond. So we'll see you then.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.